I'm not sure I have any cheerier notes to add, but on a somewhat different tack. But I'd like to talk about our tools and getting the job done. And specifically, the job here is to turn the economy around. The government is the one that we're relying on to at least get that process going. And so let me make an analogy first. Let's talk a little bit about tools and how you use tools. Let's say you have something you have to do around home, a little home repair, and you have, maybe you're going to put up a shelf. And so you have a piece of wood, and you need to cut that wood to the appropriate size, and then you need to hammer it to the wall, nail it to the wall. All right, well, first you're going to go seek out your tools. And you have to have the appropriate tool for the appropriate job. So you would probably, since you have to cut this board to size, you'd probably go get a saw. And that would be the tool for that. And then you've got to nail it to the wall, so you go get your hammer. All right? So a couple of lessons right there already. One is that you need a tool for each job. Okay, the second thing is you have to assign the appropriate tool to the appropriate job. You're probably going to get a lot further in your project if you use the saw to cut the wood and the hammer to drive the nail in than if you reverse that. Okay? So the same is true with government policy. They have some objectives. That would be the job, what they're trying to do. Job number one, as declared by both parties, is to try to bring down the unemployment rate. Typically, though, we have in mind that we want that to be done while keeping inflation under control. So that is sort of job number two. All right, it's well known in economics, a well-known economic result, that you need a tool for each job. So we have two basic tools, monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is spending and taxing, you know, what the government does. And that is best used, just like the saw for cutting the board, fiscal policy is best used trying to stimulate the economy. You know, the old days, consumers would pull back on spending a bit, our typical inventory type cycle, and the government would, if you will, just sort of replace the spending that consumers were withdrawing during that down cycle by spending on government projects and that kind of thing. That was pretty effective. They'd maybe even cut tax rates a bit to stimulate consumer spending, and that's been shown to be pretty effective. Okay, so you have fiscal policy is pretty good at stimulating the economy. Now, monetary policy has clearly designed to control inflation. That's what it's good at. We've had, you know, better and worse success under different Fed chairmen, but they've learned through the years, and with the systems that are in place now and how they target money supply and inflation directly as opposed to interest rates, we're pretty good at keeping inflation pretty much where we want it. All right, so you got a couple of tools, you got a couple of targets. Unfortunately now, what's happened is, as Dean Cady said, you know, we really misused the fiscal policy tool. Whether it was enough, not appropriately used, what I'm going to argue is that it was not appropriately used. It's not so much that it wasn't enough, but if it had been used in the right way, all this government, additional government spending, and we're still seeing some of it come through the economy, we're not finished yet, but if it had been appropriately used, it would have been more effective. And so we just cannot pass, I agree with you completely, we cannot pass another spending bill. We don't have the money for it. It would all have to come from China. That's out of the question. But there is more of the spending to be done. We have to do it appropriately. So having shot their main bullet on that, though, now we're relying on the Fed, monetary policy, to do everything. Monetary policy is not best designed to help stimulate the economy and reduce unemployment. So what we're really doing here is we're trying to drive the nail in with the saw. We're whacking away at it with the saw. And you can imagine that that's not a very effective way to drive the nail of unemployment down. So we need to refocus the efforts of the government. And primarily, the lesson is this: monetary policy cannot do it all. But because Congress and the administration have pretty much shot the fiscal policy bullet already, that's what we have left. So there really are no new tools. You know, you read Bernanke speak, Volcker speaking, what should we do? And you hear them say things like, we need to you know, re-employ or employ some new tools. What new tools? There are no new tools. That's what we have. We have to use them more effectively and more appropriately. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at unemployment. That comes to sort of a second part of this whole why are we still in such lethargic times, and how do we stimulate it? The government is only about 15 to 20% of our economy. The 80% is us. We are the economy. The government just sort of sets incentives and directions and uses these tools I've talked about, but we are the economy. It's because we have pulled back spending, because we actually are beginning to save money again, which is unheard of for the last 30 years, that producers aren't selling as much product as they would like to be, and therefore they're not hiring as many people as we would like for them to. So the government alone, first of all, cannot do it. What they have to do is to use the tools to properly incentivize the private sector to do what we want them to do, which is create jobs, increase business. Now, how do you do that? Do you do that by looking backward at the industries that we used to be good at? Automobiles, that's the largest decline. In the last 2.5 years, manufacturing of automobiles and related parts is the largest decline in our economy, that together with, of course, housing. And so, you know, we look at competition with foreign countries. We look at the reasons why our automobiles aren't competitive. And in essence, our policies are trying to re-stimulate the auto sector. We're trying to re-stimulate housing back to the levels it used to produce. That's looking backward. One suggestion I have to reorienting our policies to being more effective is to look at some of the more future-looking industries. If we're going to spend this stimulus money, it shouldn't be to bring back automobiles. It should be for job retraining into the new industries of the future. Communications, information, IT of all sorts. We hear so much about the United States not being competitive in manufacturing, and we wring our hands and say, oh, it's all due to outsourcing and competition with the Chinese. We'll never be able to make it. What you never hear talked about is that we actually have an international surplus in the service sector. We're still dominant in financial services, insurance, all kinds of professional activities, and we run a trade and international surplus in those fields. So let's reorient policy. Let's first of all not expect the Fed to do everything, because they can't. They have limitations. They're talking about buying more bonds. I'm sure we'll have some comments about that and what that's likely to do. If anything, I think nothing, because it's hammering with the saw. But for the fiscal expenditures that we have left, the tax changes that are likely to come, let's orient those in a more positive direction, stimulating the industries where we do have competitive opportunity, where we can grow, and that would be sustainable growth, meaning we can maintain that advantage internationally, rather than trying to look to the past and, you know, clobber our trade partners to help us improve our economy.